Rashad Jennings, DeSean Jackson, Julius Thomas, Isaiah Crowell, and Roddy White. They're all battling injuries coming into this week's games. I'll give you an update on each player and let you know if you should risk having them in your lineup this week. I'll also give you my busts and sleepers for week 14, and of course, I'll answer your questions from YouTube and Twitter. It's all on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. I am your host, Nick, also known as Kliquid, and I'm here twice a week, every week, to answer your questions and give you the advice that you need to win your fantasy football leagues. And winning is what I'm going to be talking about today, guys, because during the regular season, it's all about surviving. Going 7-6, going 8-5 can get you into the playoffs. And, you don't necessarily need to go out there and win every single game to get to an 8-5 and a 7-6. You just need to go out there and be better than the average team in a lot of leagues to make the playoffs. I know there are many leagues out there where if it's a 12-team league, 6 teams make the playoffs, or it's a 10-team league and 6 teams or even 4 teams make the playoffs. And really all that you have to be there is average or slightly above average. So earlier in the season, a lot of times when you guys are asking me questions, I'm answering them and trying to give you kind of a more conservative approach, because the goal isn't necessarily to win every single game. It's to win most games. And that's really kind of the important factor there. Now, when we make it to the playoffs, we're not playing against the people that have the weaker lineups. We're playing against the people that conceivably probably have better lineups, or at least close to as good of a lineup as you do heading into the playoffs. So our approach has to be a little bit different. We have to start talking a little bit more about upside. You have to take your chances. You cannot be conservative going up against other good teams. If you try and be conservative, you're going to end up with, 100 points for the week, and your opponent's going to get 120 and you're going to lose. And yeah, you might be happy with the fact that you put up 100 points on a week that, maybe the average team maybe only put up 90, let's say. Good for you. But if you would have put in the guy that maybe had the breakout game as opposed to the guy that only got 6 points and is, kind of the more conservative approach, you might have had a better chance to actually win that game. So that's kind of the difference in the playoffs versus the regular season. In the playoffs, I am definitely willing to take more chances to try and make it and try and get that W, because if you lose, you go home in fantasy football. It's as frustrating as that as it can be. There's been so many times throughout my fantasy football career where I've made it to the playoffs and I'm either out in the first round or I'm out, at some point, maybe the second round if it's a 3-week playoff where you've got buys and things like that. But I've really tried to change my philosophy, and it's more about not finishing in 5th and 4th place, but more trying to finish in 2nd or 1st place and get to that championship game. And if I don't make it because I took a chance on a guy who I thought would have a big game and another guy had, 6 more points than him and he was the more conservative approach and my guy didn't have quite what I expected, I'm willing to live with that. What I'm not willing to do is look at the matchups, see a guy that has a good matchup and bench him for somebody that has just an okay matchup that's maybe been a little bit better throughout the year. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not losing that way. I need to take the chance and try and win in my league every single time in the playoffs. It's all about winning in the playoffs. It's not about, like I said, being the better than average team that just, scrapes along and sneaks in at the end. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really maximizing your chances to win this week against other good teams. So keep that in mind, guys, as we go through this, because there could be some controversial decisions here in terms of the players that I'm going to be telling you to play and the players that I'm going to be telling you to bench. because, again, it's all about that upside. We have to try and get as many points as we can this week. So let's start things off today with a little bit more on the side of, just trying to figure out who is and isn't going to actually play this week. So we're going to talk about injuries, and I know there are a bunch of them as we head into week 14. Kind of sucks that so many big guys are facing injuries. Obviously, we know Andre Ellington is not going to play this week, so that's a little bit frustrating. You're kind of looking at a variety of players that could get touches there in Arizona. None of them have a great matchup this week. It's just not a good situation right now for the Arizona Cardinals. We talked about this before on numerous podcasts, but they have the hardest schedule in the league going down the stretch as far as defenses that they go up against. And the fact that Andre Ellington, their best fantasy player, is going to miss this week's game, it's going to be tough for them. I don't see a whole lot of ways that they end up having a good game this week. So, you look at it like that, and whether it's Marion Grice or whether it's Stefan Taylor, I just don't really mind either of them. I don't really think that either of them is good enough that I'm really going to be putting them into my fantasy lineup against the Chiefs, because the Chiefs they've struggled as of late, but over the course of the season, they have been one of the best fantasy defense, specifically against running backs. They've hardly allowed anything in the way of touchdowns, so I'm just not risking it. I don't think that you want any piece of this Arizona backfield. If you have to have somebody, I guess Stefan Taylor, just because he's been kind of called this, he's been anointed the starter, I guess. I know I told you Marion Grice earlier in the week, but that's kind of what we've been told, is that Stefan Taylor is going to get the start, and that might just be because of experience, but I don't know. Like I said, I'm not really particularly excited about either of these guys, but I'm going to give it to Stefan Taylor now, just given the additional information that we have. Also, Jerick McKinnon placed on the injured reserve for the Minnesota Vikings. Jerick McKinnon obviously wasn't as important for fantasy owners as an Andre Ellington is, but when you look at a guy like, a Ben Tate, and that's your other option there. Matt Asiata being obviously another guy who could touch the ball. But again, these are not good options from a fantasy standpoint. They're just really not. So I'm not particularly excited about either of these guys either. You could do worse, I suppose. But the Jets, if there's anything that they're good at, it's stopping the run. So I'm looking in other directions right now until we get a better idea of how things are going to look for the Vikings. I know some people are excited about Asiata's chances now that McKinnon's out, but Matt Asiata was benched essentially. And when I say benched, I don't mean that he actually sat on the bench, because he did get some playing time, but he was sat aside in a majority of the plays because Jerick McKinnon was the more talented player. And they went out and acquired Ben Tate while both of these guys were healthy, presumably because they thought that they could get something out of Ben Tate. Not necessarily a starting running back or anything, but somebody who could contribute. So I look at this situation as being a running back by committee right now. I don't think either of these guys will touch the ball 15 times this week. And that's kind of what I look at as far as what I want out of a running back. Anything less than that, we're really banking on a touchdown, because if they only get 10 touches, even if they get 5 yards per touch, that's only 50 yards. Unless they get into the end zone, that is not good enough to be in your fantasy football lineup. So to me, you need to definitely avoid this if you can. If you are going to go with one of the Vikings running backs, and you just have to given the scenario, I guess I'm going to go with Asiata, but I don't really love either of them either. Let's move on now and talk about some guys who are kind of questionable coming into this game. This week's games, First one, Rashad Jennings. This one affects a lot of fantasy owners because he's going to be going up against the Tennessee Titans defense that has been atrocious lately. I mean, they're one of the absolute worst teams in the league right now. They are really, really bad, and they've kind of been beat up everywhere, mostly against the pass, it seems, but against the run, they really haven't done great either. Now, Rashad Jennings did actually travel with the team, so he is going to be on the sidelines at least as they head to Tennessee, but I just think you have to sit him if you have other even moderately good options. We just don't know what we're going to get out of him. I know there are going to be a lot of people out there that don't really have better options right now because Rashad Jennings was the guy that you've been riding all season, and I understand that. That's a tough situation to be in, and in that case, look, if you want some sort of positivity, he did run for 91 yards and 2 touchdowns last week against a weak Jaguars defense, so it wouldn't be inconceivable to see him have another decent game if he does suit up this week. But if he's out there right now, I think you have to go and get Andre Williams if you're a Rashad Jennings owner, and drop somebody else on your roster who's irrelevant, because at this point there are mostly most teams right now have at least a player or two that they could drop. Players that aren't going to play for you for the remainder of the season. If you have a second defense, a second tight end, a second kicker, obviously drop those guys. But the big ones, make sure that your bench, you get rid of your guys that just aren't going to play for you. If for example, let's say a Marcus Colston is on your team or something like that, and you're in a 10 or a 12 team league and you have good receivers, I understand it sucks to get rid of a Marcus Colston because he might end up on somebody else's roster, but what are the chances that he's really going to have huge games from here on out that's going to hurt you anyway? I just don't see it. I mean, that's just an example of somebody that I would be willing to get rid of. Obviously, there are tons of guys lower than that I would get rid of as well. But just that kind of a level of player, I don't really care. What's the difference between Marcus Colston and Jarvis Landry at this point? There really isn't much. So just go out there and pick up a guy like an Andre Williams so that in case your running back does end up not playing, that you have another option at the running back position, because there just aren't going to be a whole hell of a lot of other guys out there that have better matchups than going against the Tennessee Titans right now. Next guy we've got on the list, DeSean Jackson, against the St. Louis Rams. Now, he was injured twice last week, and I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. I don't remember if the two injuries were actually related or not, but I believe both of them were lower extremity injuries. So, look, the guy has an injured leg going into this week. There might not be a player who is more speed oriented than DeSean Jackson. The guy doesn't run great routes. He's not physically skilled, as far as like his physical body shape. He's not 6'5". He's a smaller receiver. He needs his speed to get open. So to me, a guy that's battling a leg injury against the St. Louis defense that has looked very, very good as of late. They've stopped the Broncos. They've beaten good teams lately. And, playing DeSean Jackson against that type of a defense, to me, I just don't like it. Colt McCoy, I don't see him having the huge arm to be able to get the ball deep to DeSean Jackson, even if he does play. And if Jackson does play, if he's not 100%, what's the point? If the guy's running at 80% speed, let's say, then he's an average speed NFL receiver. Then what is he? Because he's not a great route runner. He's not, like I said, physically, huge or anything like that. So it's just, to me, this is the week where you bench DeSean Jackson. And frankly, if you have Colt McCoy even in like a 2-quarterback league, I'm probably benching him this week as well, because this is a tough defense. It's an underrated defense. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. I believe St. Louis would be a division winner in at least 2 other divisions right now. The NFC South, I think, is a pretty obvious one. I don't think there's really much debate about that. The NFC South is full of just terrible, terrible teams. And I actually think that right now, the AFC North, I think they could win. If there was a situation where they were actually, in that division and got to play 6 games against the other teams in the division, I do think there's a real shot that St. Louis could actually win that division even. But as it turns out, they're going to finish 4th in their own division, as crazy as that seems. So, St. Louis is in a really tough situation as a franchise, but defensively, they have some serious talent. They have some amazing pass rushers. They've got Chris Long back now, and Robert Quinn is still just an animal. So I do not expect Colt McCoy to have a lot of time in the pocket this week. And if DeSean Jackson's injured or even just hampered on the field, that is going to do a dramatic amount of, it's going to hurt their offense overall. So I just don't really love either of these guys this week, and I would probably try and bench both of them if you can. Next guy, Julius Thomas, is going to be up against the Buffalo Bills, and this is a big matchup actually for the Broncos, because they have to go out there and they have to try and beat some of these teams that have good front sevens, and that's what the Buffalo Bills have. They currently lead the NFL in sacks. They are putting up crazy numbers. They were a great team at getting sacks last year as well, so this is not a fluke. And Julius Thomas has missed each of his past 2 games with an injury. He got injured 3 games ago. So there has been a substantial amount of time now where Julius Thomas has not been giving his fantasy owners anything at all. And it's been frustrating because these guys play in late games. The Denver Broncos play in a lot of late games, just given the fact that they're a West Coast team. So, you really look at it like, you don't really have many other options unless you play a guy in the early games, for example. And you take a chance and you say, I'm gonna sit Julius Thomas and I'm gonna play Kyle Rudolph or something like that. And then you risk the chance that Julius Thomas plays and puts up 2 touchdowns. That's the kind of difference maker that Julius Thomas is. He's a legitimate tight end 1, absolutely. One of the top 3 fantasy football tight ends when he's healthy. And he put up huge numbers this year, obviously. He was on pace at one point, not just to beat the touchdown record for tight ends, but to beat the touchdown record for any position. So, you look at it like that, and obviously Julius Thomas, if he plays, has to be in your lineup. But we do not know if he is going to play for a 3rd straight week. There has not been indication on whether he's going to play or not. Obviously, he's getting better at this point, but we still don't necessarily know. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. And what I always tell people, when I go into the season, there's an underrated thing that I look at that I don't think a lot of people do, and it kind of hurts me in a way, but it helps me in a lot of ways as well. And one of the things that I do is I tend to avoid players who have that play in the West Coast, I should say. So players that are likely to have late start games, the guys that play, like I said, the NFC West, the AFC West teams. Now, obviously, as of late, there haven't been a whole lot of fantasy relevant players in those divisions outside of the teams, the Chargers and the Broncos. All the other teams have been pretty much a barren wasteland for fantasy value. I mean, obviously you've got your Russell Wilson and you've got Anquan Bolden's been okay, but there aren't a lot of other guys in these divisions where, you are really excited about what they do from a fantasy standpoint. But even for the Broncos and the Chargers and those players that do stand out on those teams, I still do tend to avoid them more than I do other players. And that's not to say that I don't draft them, because obviously I'm a big Peyton Manning supporter. I think that the guy's the best quarterback in football. Don't hit me with an Aaron Rodgers. Like, I understand Aaron Rodgers is unbelievable. I'm not going to sit here and debate about that. I think Aaron Rodgers is an unbelievable player. And if you think he's the best quarterback, great. That's totally fine. I'm not going to debate you on that. But look, I'm not biased against these guys, but I look at it from the standpoint of exactly what we're looking at right now. This has happened many, many times over the course of seasons, and it's happened a lot with Ryan Matthews as well, because Ryan Matthews is the kind of guy that's been banged up, numerous times throughout his career. And one of the reasons that I tend to not have him on my team is because I know that he plays in these late games. And we see a lot of situations like this where he comes into the week questionable. He's practiced in a limited capacity late in the week, and he's clearly not at 100%. Is he going to play? Is he not going to play? We never really know until the actual kickoff. And at that point, it's too late in a lot of leagues, because you've already had to either play your guy earlier in the games, or you have to sit and try and handcuff him to some other mediocre running back on another team, or maybe even on his own team, who is not going to be able to put up the type of numbers that Matthews would if he was playing. So it puts you in a really tough bind from a fantasy standpoint when you start these guys and you have them on your roster with these West Coast players. And, it's just something that I just really try and pay close attention to. And like I said, it's not that I don't draft them, but if I'm looking at a guy and another guy who I think are moderately comparable to one another, I'm typically going to go with the guy who plays on the East Coast, because those teams tend to play earlier in the day for obvious reasons, just based off of how the time zones work. Something to think about for next year. Obviously, guys, we'll talk about this more next season. We'll talk about this in the offseason a little bit, and I'll try and give you guys reminders about this type of stuff. Little tidbits that I've learned throughout my fantasy football career that have helped me really kind of avoid a lot of these situations. But what I will tell you is that if you do have Julius Thomas and he does end up playing, he needs to be in your fantasy lineup this week. Every single week, every time that Julius Thomas is out there, he needs to be in your lineup. But if you don't end up having a guy on your roster right now that you could play in his favor, in case he does come out, look, Virgil Green is somebody that I think you could consider picking up as an insurance policy for him. I don't love him. I think he's still primarily a blocking tight end for the Broncos, but he is somebody who will at least be a warm body on the field for you. Another guy who is somebody that you could consider picking up, Tim Wright of the New England Patriots, actually plays Sunday night against the San Diego Chargers. That's actually a good thing because we are going to see him play after Julius Thomas. So if Julius Thomas is not out there, you can go ahead and swap in Tim Wright into your lineup. I think Tim Wright's owned in like 12% of leagues right now, so not too bad. And I don't think he's going to have a monster game or anything like that, but he's had a couple touchdowns over the past couple of weeks. He's certainly becoming a bigger part of that offense. I know a lot of people were expecting him to be a huge part earlier in the year, and that certainly didn't happen. But now is the time where Tim Wright could give you a touchdown, and that's something that you can't overlook. There aren't a whole lot of other guys that have a good chance to score a touchdown like Tim Wright does. So he would be my guy as my number one guy. I think he's owned in about 12% of leagues. Like I said, Virgil Green, I think, is owned in practically no leagues. So if you don't have access to Tim Wright, go out there and get Virgil Green just as a backup policy for Julius Thomas this week. Like I said, there should be somebody on your roster that you're comfortable with dropping. Just drop the worst player and just, take the chance. Have Julius Thomas ready to play this week because if he's out there, he needs to be in your lineup. All right, next guy, Isaiah Crowell, who is going up against the Indianapolis Colts. He has been limited in practice this week. Now, this has been a really difficult thing for me to watch because I'm sitting here thinking the Browns have pretty much gone with the player who's been the best in practice through most of the season. So what they do is that they look at the individual running backs on a week-to-week basis and they say who practiced the best this week or who's practiced the best over the past couple of weeks. They don't even really necessarily care who was the most productive in the game last week. We've seen it numerous times this year where one guy's put up big numbers, well, not necessarily big numbers, but decent enough numbers, at least from a fantasy standpoint, and then the next week the guy gets 2 to 3 carries. Well, another guy has a big game. And it's happened to Crowell, it's happened to Terrence West, it certainly happened to Ben Tate, but now we see Isaiah Crowell, who hasn't practiced hardly at all this week. So what happens? Terrence West has been the only guy out there fully practicing. Well, not necessarily the only guy practicing, because we've actually heard the coaching staff in Cleveland say that they might consider giving Glenn Winston some reps. Who? Glenn Winston? Like, was this the 5th running back that's gotten carries for these guys this year? I mean, this is a freaking carousel. This is a complete joke. And the Browns are in the middle of a playoff hunt. These guys could end up being the team that wins the AFC North. It's baffling. But the one thing that I will say is that they have also mentioned that Terrence West has been disappointing recently. He's been, and actually one of them, the head coach out there said that he has been quote unquote careless with the football. That's not a good sign. Anytime that a guy is being called careless by the coaching staff, oh my goodness, we're in for some serious trouble. The guy could end up not playing any football that week. So my opinion is that I am not excited about this backfield right now. Isaiah Crowell being limited in practice and Terrence West being the kind of guy that just isn't being trusted right now by the coaching staff. Glenn Winston's name being brought up. There could be a 3-headed backfield, or it could end up being any one of these 3 guys. But they're going up against Indianapolis, who has not been a bad defense, but they haven't been a great defense. It's not a spectacular matchup by any means, and especially when you consider the fact that the Colts could end up putting some decent points on the board this week. That makes it tough to run the football. If the Colts come out here and they get out to a 10-0 lead or a 13-3 lead or something like that, and it's halftime, then the Browns really have to start looking at possibly not running the football anymore. Or maybe they put out Johnny Manziel on the field, and then what happens? Johnny Manziel is going to be running around himself. They're going to want to see what they have in this guy, and then they're going to be not running the football as much. So My opinion is that you try and avoid this situation as much as you can this week specifically. I want to see what happens with Isaiah Crowell. If we hear before the game start that Crowell is looking like he's 100% or something like that, then okay, I think that he's probably going to be the guy, even though he has been limited in practice. But given the fact that we don't think he is going to be 100% and he hasn't practiced and all these other things, we just don't know. We just don't know what the situation is, and I don't like the chances of him having a huge game, even if he is healthy. Last guy, as far as injury updates go, and if anything else comes up prior to the games, of course, if you guys have any questions and I have any information, I will answer them in the comments section below. But Roddy White against the Green Bay Packers, he will be playing on Monday night. Now, he didn't play against Arizona in Week 13 in a game that frankly, the Falcons needed to win. It was an important win. They did get it, but at the same time, though, you look at this as being a very, very difficult situation from a fantasy standpoint. If a guy didn't play in a game that the team needed to win, what are the chances that he's actually healthy right now? Now, I will say that head coach Mike Smith has said that Roddy White is likely to play on Monday night, but he's still a huge risk coming into Monday Night Football, guys. Roddy White, I don't think, is the type of talent at this point that you're risking having him on your team and playing him and just, benching all your other guys who are going to play on Sunday, given the fact that we don't know he's going to play. There are other guys out there, if you've got a Calvin Johnson, a Demaryius Thomas, those type of players that are just game changers completely. Yeah, you have to have them in your lineup if they're going to be even likely to play. And I think Roddy White is kind of likely to play at this point. I would probably, given what I've read and what I've seen from the coaching staff and just kind of the way that they've approached it, I would give him about a 75% chance of playing on Monday Night Football. But what does that mean? Is he going to be, fully healthy at that point? I don't think so. Not to say that the Green Bay secondary is amazing, but they do force turnovers, and that could mean a lot of Green Bay offense, which could mean less opportunities for the Falcons as well. The other thing to consider is that the Falcons do actually have other decent options in their passing game if Roddy White can't play. This past week, Harry Douglas played well. He had 9 catches for 116 yards with Roddy White out. There's nothing to worry about there. I mean, that's good production. And even Devin Hester has had some decent games from time to time. So, they do have other options. Obviously, Julio Jones being the monster that he is. They have 2, 3, possibly 4 guys that can catch the football in that offense. So I don't really think that there's a need for them to rush Roddy White out there or to have him out there for every snap either. So if he's not out there for every snap and he's not necessarily even going to play, I just think I'm probably trying to avoid him. Like I said, if you are in a situation where you have to start Roddy White, if you just don't have better options, I would go out there and try and pick up a Harry Douglas as kind of being his handcuff, I guess. Harry Douglas is owned in very few leagues right now, so you should be able to go out there and acquire him in just about every league. Now, the other player that I would consider going out there and grabbing, Davante Adams, who plays for the Packers, he's kind of another good option for a handcuff. A lot of people like to look at guys that are on the same roster, and in this case, I would as well because Harry Douglas is produced. But I think Davante Adams for the Packers could be a good quote-unquote handcuff for Roddy White this week, given the fact that they both play on Monday Night Football. So if you end up in a situation where Harry Douglas isn't available for some reason, you have Roddy White on your roster, he doesn't end up starting, Davante Adams should be out there in most leagues right now. You should be able to go and get him. He had a nice game this past week, and just being the third option in the Green Bay offense, it's not that bad. So I think he's a decent opportunity for you if Roddy White ends up not playing and you're kind of stuck in a bad situation. All right, guys, so let's talk about the fan questions that you guys sent in this week. If you have any questions for me, of course, be sure to tweet them to me at Kliquid TV, Or you can, of course, leave them in the comment section below on the YouTube video, and I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can prior to Sunday's games. Obviously, if there's anything that it requires, a lot of in-depth analysis or anything like that, I'm probably just going to, skip over it. If you guys have, if you're asking me your entire lineup or something like that, and you're in, a giant league where you start 20 players, and yes, there have been people that have been doing that in some of these questions. Typically, I'm not going to answer those just because it's too much work, and I need to, try and answer as many questions as I can from other people. But hopefully, you'll get some of the answers that you need from these other questions and some of the talking that I've done on these other topics. So the first question comes from 37 Will Dog on YouTube, and he asks, "What's your opinion on CJ Spiller? He's supposed to return in Week 16. Do you think he's worth an ad?" All right, so of course, it depends, I think, on the size of your league. If you're in an 8-team league, a 10-team league, even a 12-team league, I'm kind of not too excited about him. The nice thing about CJ Spiller right now coming back in Week 16 is that he is going to be a player who only probably 2 teams are going to be actually looking for, 4 teams possibly, if he's still out there on the waiver wire at this point in your league. There just probably aren't going to be a whole lot of teams out there that have the capacity to pick him up on their roster next week. So if you're still looking at him as being available, chances are he's going to be available after Sunday's games. So, then you're kind of looking at 2 teams being knocked out probably in your playoffs if you're in a 12-team league and you have 6 for your playoffs, or you only have 4 teams at least is what I'm basically getting at as we go into weeks 15 and 16. So about, 2/3 of your league should not even be considering picking up CJ Spiller. So that makes things a little bit easier for us. What I will say, though, I don't love CJ Spiller. I've never been a big supporter of his. Even last year when people were talking about him as being a top 5 player going into the season, which sounds bizarre now at this point, but I just don't think that the guy has the skills to be an every down running back in the NFL. Obviously, we've seen him have big games from time to time, but he's not built for it. He's a smaller running back. He's not super skilled outside of his speed. I just don't really view him as being that every down running back for an NFL team. I kind of think he's a good change of pace back. I think he and Fred Jackson make a pretty good duo when they're both healthy. But when one of them's not healthy and the other one has to share the brunt of the carries, we've seen that these guys get hurt on a pretty regular basis. And that's just kind of where we're at with him. So I question if CJ Spiller, once he comes back, number one, if he's going to be fully in football shape, because he's been out for quite some time now. Is he going to have rust that he needs to kick off? And if he does, we're in week 16 by the time he comes back. Is that really the time that we want to start throwing in guys who are not fully healthy into our lineup? I don't. And then number two, Fred Jackson's back and he's healthy. Anthony Dixon's looked decent. Bryce Brown has even had some decent carries from time to time. Is he even going to be the feature back there in Buffalo? My opinion is no. I don't think CJ Spiller is going to be back. I don't think he's going to be healthy. My personal opinion is that I'm not adding him in any leagues unless we see a situation where Fred Jackson gets hurt this week. If Fred Jackson goes down, I think the tables completely change. I think then you're looking at he could potentially be getting 75-85% of the snaps for that team, and then he becomes a viable fantasy option down the stretch as at least a flex, if not a low-end RB2. So, it's frustrating because we wish he could have come back maybe 2 weeks ago so that we could analyze this situation a little bit better prior to the point where we have to start him in our championship week of week 16. I just don't think it's the time to do it. Like I said, we'll reanalyze it in week 16 if we need to, but for right now, I don't think I would be really excited about adding CJ Spiller in anything other than maybe a 14-team league. Next question comes from Miles Kalish on YouTube, and he asks a lineup question for this week. Do I go with Matt Stafford versus Tampa Bay or Ben Roethlisberger versus Cincinnati? So, obviously, Ben Roethlisberger has been the guy who has had huge games this year. He had 2 6-touchdown games in a row. Absolutely insane numbers for Big Ben. But ever since then, he's kind of been mediocre. And Antonio Brown's not putting up the big numbers that he was. Martavis Bryant's not putting up the massive touchdown numbers that he was. Matthew Stafford has been disappointing this season. I will tell you that I banked on him as being my quarterback in quite a few leagues, and I've been very disappointed in him. He has not put up the big numbers that I expected. Even with Calvin Johnson back, he isn't putting up huge numbers. He's putting up okay numbers, certainly startable, but not necessarily the top 5 quarterback numbers that I had expected coming into the season. So I'm a little bit biased, but I am still going to go with Matt Stafford. I think that the upside is better for him, and I know it sounds crazy given the fact that Ben has had 2 6-touchdown games, but the other games this season and through the course of his career, Big Ben is just not a great fantasy quarterback. He's always been a borderline starter, and that's just not really anything to be excited about here. I talked about it earlier in the show. I'm going for guys that I think have the higher upside, and the guys that, their ceiling is higher and maybe their floor isn't quite as high, but I don't think it's substantially different. I don't think Matt Stafford's floor is much different than Big Ben's, but his ceiling is, in my opinion, significantly higher. So I am going to go with him against a weak Tampa Bay secondary that struggled all season. I think that he could put up big numbers here, and I like Calvin Johnson's chances of having a big game here as well, of course. Next question comes from Loyal Subscriber on YouTube. I love that name, and I know you've been a subscriber for quite some time, so thank you so much, buddy. His question has to do with Trey Mason at Washington or LaShawn McCoy at Seattle. Now, obviously, LaShawn McCoy has been crazy good lately. He's been putting up good numbers, just like we expected him to do coming into the season, but Trey Mason has actually been just as good lately, and he has a substantially better matchup here. The Washington Redskins defense, obviously, they have not been good this season. They actually haven't been bad against the run, to be completely honest with you, but they haven't been spectacular as of late. This past week, they actually allowed the Indianapolis Colts running backs to run for over 100 yards and a touchdown against them. They allowed a 3-touchdown game earlier this year to Matt Asiata. So they've struggled against some of the bigger running backs that they've faced, and that's kind of what I see in a Trey Mason. I don't necessarily mean bigger as far as like physical size. What I'm more saying is like they're strength runners, and I see a little bit of that in Trey Mason. I think that he has a good chance of scoring a touchdown in this game. LaShawn McCoy, obviously, he is a spectacular talent, but the Seahawks are a great defense. These are the type of defenses that we just do not like to go up against. The Seahawks have only allowed one team to rush for 100 yards against them since week 6 when they faced DeMarco Murray. The only running backs who've put up big numbers against this defense have been DeMarco Murray and Jamal Charles. And I understand LaShawn McCoy is in that type of caliber. Certainly he's a tier 1 running back. I get it. But this is not a great matchup. This is the kind of matchup where if Philadelphia ends up struggling to put up points, which they could, they very well could, we could see not a lot of LaShawn McCoy. We could see a lot of passing. We could see a lot of turnovers as well, because Mark Sanchez is actually pretty prone to that, and I know he hasn't been so prone to it this year, but the guy is not some superstar talent. This team is not worried about Mark Sanchez beating them. I'll tell you that right now. They're going to put Richard Sherman up against a wide receiver, and I don't know which receiver it's going to be necessarily. They're going to have him lined up one-on-one the entire game, and they're going to say, test him. Go ahead and test him. And Brandon Browner is going to be lined up probably one-on-one against another receiver, and they're going to test him. And if Mark Sanchez can't get the job done, if he can't beat them deep, there's going to be a long day for LaShawn McCoy, because he's going to see 7, 8, possibly even 9 in the box on certain plays. That makes it very, very difficult to run the football. Now, I will say to you guys, I like LaShawn McCoy this week. I think that he is still somebody that I'm starting. He's definitely an RB1 in my opinion this week. But I like Trey Mason slightly better. I just think the upside's better. And I know that sounds absolutely crazy. I get where you guys are coming from here. I know there's going to be comments about this. Why the hell would you bench LaShawn McCoy for Trey Mason? But it's all about upside to me. I think Trey Mason has the higher upside this week. I would not be surprised if LaShawn McCoy puts up 60 yards with no touchdown, but I would be surprised if Trey Mason is held under 70 yards, and I would also be pretty surprised if he doesn't score a touchdown in this one. So I am going to go with him. Next question comes from Daniel Lett on YouTube, and he asks, should I play Ryan Tannehill against Baltimore or Ryan Fitzpatrick against Jacksonville? Now, this is a very good question because Ryan Fitzpatrick is coming off of easily the best game of his career. Ryan Tannehill coming off a very disappointing game against the Jets. But I am going to go with Ryan Tannehill. And I know it sounds crazy. You can't necessarily forget about what the guys did last week, but Ryan Fitzpatrick is not a 6-touchdown-a-game guy. He's not somebody that has done that over the course of his career. He hasn't even been a viable fantasy quarterback hardly ever at any point in his career. I don't trust it this week. I know the Jaguars are bad. I get it. But I don't necessarily think that the Texans are going to have to pass the ball that much. I mean, if they go out there and they run the football and they put up, if they get out to a decent lead, there's going to be a hell of a lot of Arian Foster. And I will tell you guys, Arian Foster is my running back 1 this week for fantasy football. So if you guys like Arian Foster this week, like I do, that probably means there's not going to be a heck of a lot of Ryan Fitzpatrick. On the other side of the football, Baltimore has been absolutely atrocious against opposing quarterbacks this season, especially lately. They have really, really struggled, guys. They have allowed a total of 13 touchdowns over their past 4 games. Now, obviously, that includes a 6-touchdown game to Big Ben back in Week 9, but they also allowed 3 touchdowns to Drew Brees, 3 touchdowns to Phillip Rivers. Now, I understand. Don't trust me. Ryan Tannehill is not Phillip Rivers, and he's certainly not Drew Brees, but he's decent enough to put up a solid fantasy day for you here against the Baltimore Ravens, who have significantly struggled as of late against the pass. I think that they're going to be out there passing a lot in this one because of the fact that the Baltimore Ravens run defense is one of the absolute best in the league. I think Ryan Tannehill is going to have a big day this week. From at least from a Ryan Tannehill standpoint, I would be surprised if he's not at least 250 yards, and I like him to throw a couple of touchdowns as well in this game. So I am going to go with Tannehill. Next question comes from OG Madden God on Twitter, and he wants to know, do I start Eli Manning at Tennessee or Ryan Fitzpatrick at Jacksonville? So another question involving your guy Ryan Fitzpatrick. So this one I'm a little bit more torn on because I don't trust Eli Manning lately. But what I will tell you guys is that the Titans have been just horrendous lately against opposing quarterbacks. They are absolutely getting toasted. This past week, obviously, they allowed 6 touchdowns to Ryan Fitzpatrick. It's an embarrassing thing at this point. They haven't allowed a ton of touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks, but when you look at Mark Sanchez throwing for 300 yards and Ryan Fitzpatrick throwing for 350 yards and 6 touchdowns, and earlier this year it was Brian Hoyer who had a big game, and I don't think that there is a lot to be worried about for Eli Manning in this game. I don't think the Titans are going to intercept him a lot, and I think there's a good chance that they allow multiple touchdowns through the air in this contest. Jacksonville's defense, obviously we talked about this, they're not great, and Fitzpatrick had a big game last week, but he's Ryan Fitzpatrick. I'm not trusting him for my fantasy playoffs. I'm just not. I can't do it. If I have another viable option, if I have Eli Manning, if I have Ryan Tannehill, I'm playing those guys over Ryan Fitzpatrick at this point. If I end up losing because I set Ryan Fitzpatrick on my bench, I can live with that. What I can't live with is watching Eli Manning throw for 3 touchdowns and 300 yards while Ryan Fitzpatrick throws for 170 and 1 touchdown. I just can't live with it. If I lose my fantasy week because Ryan Fitzpatrick is my quarterback, I'm going to be just beyond upset. So for me, I could not do it. I could not play a Ryan Fitzpatrick for over an Eli Manning, excuse me. Next question comes from Alex Wise on YouTube, and he wants to know something else about Eli Manning. Should he play Eli Manning at Tennessee or Mark Sanchez versus Seattle? And for me, this is an easy one. You go with Eli Manning. We just talked about this a little bit. Mark Sanchez, I don't believe in what he's been doing. Call me crazy, and I understand this offense, I think, is built that it can basically make any quarterback effective, but this is the type of matchup that you avoid from a fantasy standpoint. Seattle's pass defense is extraordinary. Obviously, we know that. They're the number 1 fantasy defense in points per game allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Number 1. They're the absolute most difficult defense for any quarterback to play against. So yeah, I'm not trusting Mark Sanchez. I'm going with Eli Manning in the easy matchup against the Titans. Last question of the week comes from Ramsey Farah on Twitter, and he wants to know, do I play Justin Forsett or Rashad Jennings? So we talked a little bit about Rashad Jennings, and I'm not a huge believer in the fact that he's even going to play this week. And this is a classic example, in my opinion, of you play a guy who is about as good, and Justin Forsett is more likely to play, and I understand he's dealing with a little bit of an injury himself, but it sounds to me, at least from reports, that Justin Forsett is looking better than Rashad Jennings is at this point, and Justin Forsett's played really well this year. He just has. I don't get it. I don't understand how a guy who has been a complete non-factor for numerous NFL teams at this point is suddenly a top 10 fantasy running back. But it reminds me a lot of what we saw with Brandon Lloyd a few years ago when I think he ended up leading the league in receiving yardage. It's baffling, but sometimes these things happen. It's the NFL and crazy things happen. Just guys get the opportunity and they end up just tearing it up. I don't think Justin Forsett's a long-term answer for the Ravens, but look, for the time being, he's putting up the big numbers. He's having explosive plays. He looks like a kind of running back that you can start on a week-to-week basis for fantasy. I'm going to trust him this week, and I am going to bench Rashad Jennings just given the fact that we are not certain that he's going to be healthy and that he is going to even get all of the carries for the team if he is healthy. All right, guys, so let's move on now and talk just for a moment about my busts of the week and my sleepers of the week. So if you're looking at the busts of the week, these are the guys who are normally in your lineup, but this week I am going to tell you to bench them for at least if you have other decent options. I don't think they're bench at all costs or anything like that, but definitely guys who I think maybe fall outside of their normal ranking by a pretty decent amount. And so here we are, guys. We're going to talk about the bust of the week first. So Mark Sanchez. He is going to be up against the Seattle Seahawks. I talked a little bit about this just a few moments ago. I just don't believe in Mark Sanchez, and he's just not somebody who I can trust against the Seahawks. We're headed into the playoffs. Again, guys, it's all about upside. What is his realistic upside against the number one fantasy defense against opposing quarterbacks? Let's say he even has a solid game. Is that really enough for you in the fantasy playoffs to win? What if he puts up 14 points? I mean, that's an okay game from a fantasy quarterback, but it's not enough probably to win for you. I would like a guy who has a bigger upside. I'd rather play a Ryan Tannehill. I would even probably rather play a guy like I talked about benching in a couple of these, which was Ryan Fitzpatrick. I know it's crazy. I know Mark Sanchez has had a great run here, but I don't believe it. At the end of the day, this guy is still a quarterback who is benched by the New York Jets and given away essentially for absolutely nothing. So just to me, I'm not a believer in the talent, and I'm not a believer that he suddenly became a top 10 must-start quarterback. I would certainly bench Mark Sanchez this week in a tough matchup here against the Seattle Seahawks. Next guy, Ryan Matthews. He's going to be up against the New England Patriots. Now, the Patriots defense, they struggled earlier in the year against the run. They allowed, 3 games of 175 or more rushing yards in the first half of the season? Not good. Not good at all. But in the second half of the season, they have definitely started to heat up, and they're definitely a tough defense to run on now. They've only allowed 1 rushing touchdown since week 7. Very, very impressive. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that Ryan Matthews has been splitting red zone snaps with Donald Brown lately, which makes his fantasy likelihood of putting up good points even lower. If Donald Brown, for whatever reason, takes one of those runs from the 15-yard line and gets into the end zone, that's going to crush fantasy owners. So I'm not a big supporter of Ryan Matthews this week. He is outside of my top 20 at running back. I just don't see the upside here, and I think it's going to be a tough week for the Chargers as far as moving the ball on the ground. Next one is Lamar Miller, who is going to be up against the Baltimore Ravens. I talked a little bit about this before. I think this is going to be a pass-friendly game for the Dolphins. I think that Ryan Tannehill is somebody I would certainly start in a lot of leagues, but Lamar Miller against that same defense, it's a significantly different story. The Ravens have been unbelievable against the run this season. They allowed a rushing touchdown this past week. Obviously, we saw that with the Chargers, but they've only allowed 2 total rushing touchdowns, including that one, since week 4. That's awful. That's just not good at all. From a fantasy standpoint, there's no upside here. They've held other running backs that are much better in check. They held, for example, Le'Veon Bell was held in check. Mark Ingram held in check. All these guys, Gio Bernard and Jeremy Hill held in check. It's not a good matchup at all. I don't like Lamar Miller's chances here. I think this is a lot more difficult of a matchup than people are thinking it is. I think that Lamar Miller certainly falls outside of my top 20, and he's borderline as a flex this week, in my opinion. I just don't love him. So let's move on now and talk about the sleepers of the week. This is the opposite of the busts of the week. These are the guys that normally aren't in your lineup, but I think could be this week as they have some favorable matchups for whatever reason. So first and foremost, we have Chris Ivory against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, Ivory is still, in my opinion, the favored back in New York. We saw Chris Johnson have a good game this past week, but also keep in mind that the majority of his yards came off of 1 carry. And I understand Chris Johnson's kind of known for that. That's great and all. But in my opinion, you look for the guys who are more likely to touch the ball more often. And I think that's what Chris Ivory is. I think he's the guy who is more likely to get, 60% of the snaps, 70% of the snaps at the running back position for the Jets this week. The Jets still do not trust Geno Smith to pass. They don't. We saw what happened when he had to pass. It did not turn out well. So I would think that it's fairly likely that they're going to run the ball 30 times again in this game against the Vikings. The Vikings don't have a high-powered, explosive offense, and if that's kind of the situation, well, there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for the Vikings to have the football, and when they do, they're going to have to try and pass. And what does that mean? Well, it probably is going to mean a lot of turnovers potentially in this one. We could end up seeing some short drives for the Vikings, and if that ends up happening, yeah, we could see some serious running of the football again from the Jets. It would not be surprising for me to see them go over 200 yards on the ground for the second straight week. They ran for, I think, 300 yards last week and lost, which is just mind-boggling. But, that's what happens when you can't pass the ball. And I think given the fact this game is not likely to get out to a big Vikings lead at any point, it could, but it's not likely. I think that they will still stay close, and they should be able to run the ball a lot. So given the fact that Chris Ivory is the preferred goal line back here for the Jets, as far as we know, I think that he gets the slight edge over Chris Johnson, and I would definitely look to start him. I have him ranked about 18th this week at running back, so not a huge player, but at the same time, though, a guy who you could certainly start as an RB2 in most formats. Next on the list, Andy Dalton. He is going to be up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, this is a must-win game for the Cincinnati Bengals, and that's kind of one of the reasons that I really like Andy Dalton this week. I'm not expecting him to go out there and be, clutch Andy Dalton or anything like that. I'm not expecting him to put up 6 touchdowns, but I will tell you that the Steelers have given up 20 or more quarterback points in 6 straight games from a fantasy standpoint. 6 straight games of 20+. That is just epically atrocious. Really, really, really bad. And I understand they've had some tougher matchups, but they've also had some really easy matchups where they've allowed big points to opposing quarterbacks. So this should be one where Andy Dalton can exploit that defense. I like AJ Green a lot this week. I also like Mohamed Sanu a lot this week if you're looking for a receiver. So definitely go out there and pick up Andy Dalton. I would start him over a lot of quarterbacks this week. If he's out there and some of these other people were asking, should I start Ryan Fitzpatrick or this guy? I would definitely go out there and pick up Andy Dalton and start him over Ryan Fitzpatrick this week for sure. He has an amazing matchup, and he should be able to give you some good fantasy points this week. I like him for somewhere between 18 to 22 fantasy points, so that should be good enough to give you a solid start at the quarterback position. Last guy that we're going to talk about before we wrap up today's show, Kenny Stills, who is going up against the Carolina Panthers. Now, Kenny Stills has been their best receiver since Brandon Cooks went down. 17 catches for almost 300 yards and 2 touchdowns over his past 3 games. The Panthers have given up 16 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers this season. And the Saints, I understand they do typically play better at home, but this is still a great matchup for them. This is a division game that they have to win. They're technically not still out of it, so they have to win this game. They have to try and get a W on the board. I like the chances of giving Drew Brees the ball 30, 40, potentially 50 times if the situation calls for it. They could be passing a lot in this football game, and that gives me a good chance for Kenny Stills to beat them deep for a touchdown or to at least have a good game catching some passes underneath. So good luck, guys. I think that this is obviously the clutch week for fantasy football. But that's going to do it for today's show. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you did, please be sure to give this video the thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so below so that you can be given an update when we put out the next episode. If you guys have any questions for this week's games, again, please be sure to leave them in the comment section below, or of course, you can always tweet them to me at Kliquid TV. Thank you guys again so much for listening. Check back again next week when I will have a full recap of Week 14. And of course, I will, as I always do, answer your questions from YouTube and Twitter. Thank you guys again. Good luck this week, and I will see you guys next time here on the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast.